I really enjoyed Dr. Aphra in the Vader omnibus. She had this really light, enjoyable tone to her that was just fun, and maybe it's because I'm English and Gillen is Scottish and we're neighbours, but the humour in that book that came from Aphra really tickled me. So an Aphra book written by Gillen should be just as good, right? Well, the first half that he wrote by himself was. The second half was co-written with Jason Aaron, and it's fucking awful. The Dr. Aphra Volume 1 hardcover is made of the first volume of the Aphra Trades, simply called Aphra, and the second is the Screaming Citadel crossover. Wikipedia has this listed as taking place between two stories in the third volume of the Star Wars series, so I read that story first, then read this, and to be honest, I have no idea why they have it listed that way, since it's completely irrelevant whether you do or don't read that story first. You may as well just dive right into this book, since it doesn't touch on that book at all. The first part of the book ticks all the boxes for me. Aphra being greedy, having a wicked sense of humour, things going wrong for her, and all hell breaking loose. This is where Dr. Aphra shines in my opinion. She very much has that Han Solo in Empire Strikes Back vibe about her, where everything goes wrong and it's never actually her fault. One of the highlights in terms of the humour for me was when she tried to distract two big aliens by shouting, "Look, there's the Death Star!" which I thought was fucking hilarious. So the book starts after the events of the Vader Down omnibus, where Vader thought he'd killed Aphra by spacing her. She's still taking on jobs, stealing what she can from archaeological gold mines, when the news comes in that the university where she got her degree has rejected it, and she's no longer classed as a doctor anymore, and in turn this means she's not allowed to sell archaeological finds, except on the black market of course, but there's too much risk for her there. So Aphra sets out to earn her final credit and regain the title of Doctor. We see a bit of Aphra as a student, and there's a mention of Sanastaros, and her professor explains to her that while she's Flash, archaeology is all about dedicating decades of someone's life to study something, and he shows her a group of what's called Abyssine symbiotes, an especially dangerous species that has apparently brought down countless empires in the past, and because of the danger they pose to the galaxy and the Imperial Empire, they've been banned beyond quarantine, which means they have to be burned to erase all their threats from existence. They're too dangerous to be left alive even in quarantine. Her professor hates her for mocking her all the time and lords it over her that she will never amount to anything simply because he hates her and can make her life miserable. Aphra, being the scoundrel we all love, decides not to settle for that, and sometime later claims she's made a discovery, and she's stolen her professor's symbiotes and put them in a location she had found previously, but where there was nothing of worth. And people consider this to be the archaeoxenobiological find of the century. It's just a short story, but it works and has everything that I want from an Aphra story. It's funny, it's clever, it's well written, it's just a good story. It's got Aphra acting like River Song from Doctor Who. That's all Aphra needs to be. The next story takes place in the present, where her father, who I can't tell may or may not be a clone, contacts Aphra. It's really difficult to tell if he's supposed to be a clone or not, because he has the same kind of head shape as Rex, he's bald, he has the same skin tone, and if Rex didn't have his beard, he would be a spit-in image of him. I'd be interested to see how this plays out, because that could tie into why Aphra is such a wild card. Some of it is explained in this comic, with her mother being killed by Imperials and her father being absent, but she's such a wild card that I could accept a story about her being the daughter of a clone, and that would actually open some doors to her being able to access certain Clone Wars era Republic facilities that she may raid at some point in the future of the comics. Her dad tells her that he's found something amazing, a link to the Ordu Aspectu, a group he thinks were ancient, benevolent Jedi searching for the road to immortality when they were attacked by a group of evil red lightsaber wielders who, let's face it, are Sith, although they're never named in the comic, and during the battle, the ship they were on, the Fortress of Garn, seemed to jump to hyperspace and was never heard from again. Aphra's quick to point out that his theory is just one, based on no evidence, and she puts forward a theory that's just as likely, where the Sith are based on the Fortress of Garn and the Jedi are invading, and I quite like this section because the Sith have a load of Jedi Padawans locked up into a machine, and this was almost a carbon copy of the final fight in the Knights of the Old Republic game, where you had to try and save the kidnapped Jedi if you could, but the player is normally too busy dealing with Darth Malak to do anything about them. I appreciated the references, and in both stories their robes and their armour and their lightsabers looked like something that could have been in KOTOR 3, and even the lightsabers were bigger, with Tales of the Jedi style designs with the prongs on them. They weren't quite the same, but they were definitely influenced by those comics in my opinion, and rather than just stealing, they've done their own thing with it, made their own story, and I like that, it works. Aphra's version of the story goes that the fight in the fortress caused the fortress to blow up, so there's literally nothing left of the Ordu Aspectu left to find, so her dad wasted his whole life following a fantasy while ignoring his family. Of course, the best version of the story is 000's fantasy of the Order Aspectu, where there are no Jedi, no Sith, no fortress, just a giant 000 in space wreaking havoc on a load of ships. And just like the scene where Aphra orders BT to torture her dad, it's the kind of stuff I loved about these droids in the Vader omnibus. Ruthless, soulless, guilt-free sadists, and it's funny as hell. It's this kind of randomness that makes Aphra and the droids work. Aphra agrees to help her dad where their next destination is none other than Yavin 4, and for some reason Yavin's not red. I really hope this is just a case of it's not Yavin, but look at the size of that planet, then how close the planets are around it. That's got to be Yavin. So why hasn't it been coloured right? How hard is it to watch a movie then colour the book appropriately? Who has seen Star Wars and doesn't know what colour Yavin is? I'm getting tired of saying it, so please insert your favourite Hidalgo rant here. I thought it was quite interesting that her dad was completely unaware of the Battle of Yavin, and that's why he's surprised the Imperials are investigating a former rebel base, and when Aphra asks him about the destruction of Jeddah, he says he didn't believe the story, and that before that he hadn't really noticed anyway because he was too busy working, and that triggers Aphra because he was an absentee father. He didn't care about her, he didn't care about her mum, he doesn't care about billions of lives in the galaxy. But he made a good point that Aphra is always criticising him for following leads to unbelievable fantastical things like the Ordu Aspectu, so why should he believe something like the Death Star exists? It was a good bit of writing that kind of threw Aphra's own arguments against her. The Imperials are at the Massassi temples to investigate the possibility of the rebel base, and I thought that was a strange bit of writing considering how much time has clearly taken place between here and the end of A New Hope. The crew of the Death Star, Vader and Tarkin most importantly, knew the rebels were on Yavin 4, and I just refused to believe that they didn't send a message of any kind to any other Imperials, particularly the Emperor, letting them know of the rebels' impending doom. Yes, Tarkin was arrogant and didn't think he would lose, but he's also not stupid, and Vader doesn't answer to him anyway, so I see no reason why Vader wouldn't have sent a message like that. Plus, consider the fact that the first issue of the Star Wars comic and the Darth Vader comic take place at the same time, and they must take place after the Leia, Lando, Chewie and Han comics, because half of them start right after the award ceremony in A New Hope, and how many issues and events there have been in the Star Wars and Vader comic, I find it's highly unbelievable that it's taken the Empire this long to investigate the base. I think the worst offence though is that we know the Imperials knew about the Yavin 4 base because it's in Inferno Squad. It's stated that during the Battle of Yavin, Iden Versio strayed from the Death Star and managed to land on the planet when the Death Star blew up. There she hid out, watched the rebels on the base, and then when they left she escaped and reported it back to the Empire, where she told them about the base. Now, these issues of Dr. Aphra were released about 5 months before Inferno Squad, so I have to ask, with things being produced so close together, why don't they match up? I still can't be bothered, so once again please insert one of my patented Hidalgo speeches here. The leader of the Imperials is Captain Magna Tolvan, a woman with a cybernetic neck of all things, and I'm getting pretty tired of reading this shit. They just keep adding implants to characters hoping that will make them interesting, and it really doesn't. It's a cheap gimmick, it doesn't make characters interesting, it's overused and it needs to stop. So far in the comics alone, we've had Malaris and her weird eye, and Terex with his slave implants, both from the Poe comics. I'd be shocked if Kairos from Alphabet Squadron doesn't turn out to have a load. And overall, something that was once special in the Star Wars universe has once again been bled dry by Disney. They need to stop latching onto things and milking them for all they're worth, because it's damaging the franchise. So, when they're on the planet, Black Chrysanthemum distracts the Imperials outside the temple while Aphra, Hadad and the droids look around, and I thought it was interesting how Gillen has once again borrowed lore from the Tales of the Jedi series, this time mentioning how the Massassi built the temples but they've been extinct for a millennia. I'm curious about these references to the Tales series because we know we're getting a KOTOR trilogy, and just because they were set at different times in Legends, although different ends of the same era, doesn't mean they won't try and merge them together in the new canon, and if they do, I wonder how much of the lore laid out in this comic will be completely ignored and rewritten. In the temple, they find a kind of observatory room, like that one in Skyrim, where once everything is lined up it reveals the location of the Fortress of Garn, which for some reason keeps being called a Citadel in this issue, which is quite irritating because it has absolutely nothing to do with the Screaming Citadel in the second part of the book. And once they get the location, they follow the coordinates and find the ancient fortress, offline and empty except for the bodies of the soldiers who died there. They find the central room, and in typical Star Wars style, it's full of walkways that lead to bottomless pits. The Imperials arrive and trap them inside the core computer room, where the only way out is to activate the computer, which in turn brings Rur, the leader of the Ordu Aspectu, back to life, and he's not as pleasant as you would expect a Jedi to be, even an unorthodox one. He seems to be both a plasma type being as well as inhabiting some droids, but he's been dead so long he has no idea when it is, so Aphra says she'll tell him when it is if he tells her what happened here. It's an interesting story. Rur seemed to have been working on a way to transfer his consciousness into a computer to preserve his knowledge forever, but rather than being transferred, he was copied, and the Rur inside the computer now considers the flesh and blood Rur to be fake. The Ordu Aspectu realised their mistake, tried to shut down the computer, succeeded, but the last command Rur in the computer gave was to wipe out sentient life on the station, which resulted in the death of every life form on the station, and the computer was deactivated for far more than 1,000 years. Aphra fights her way out using one of the Jedi's fallen lightsabers, and manages to take Rur's core with her, destroying the Imperials on the way. Her dad questions what to do with something so dangerous, and Aphra says she knows some guys, and they take it to a quarantine world for safekeeping. And if I'm right, I think this is the world where we first met Aphra in Vader, where she got the 000 personality matrix. But of course she wouldn't be Aphra if she did the right thing, so Gillen wrote her true to her character, and it turns out the crystal core put in the quarantine was a fake, and she plans to make a bundle with the real one, and this leads right up to the Screaming Citadel crossover. I really enjoyed this story. I think it had all the fun, quirky, crazy aspects of Aphra and the droids that were in the Vader comic, and the story was really good with Gillen drawing on lore from Legends but doing his own thing with it rather than a carbon copy like Disney seemed to be doing. In fact, I don't see any reason why the Ordu Aspectu part of the story couldn't have happened in Legends in the Old Republic, and my motto is, if it would work in Legends, that's a good thing. You can run with it. If it wouldn't work in Legends, they shouldn't do it, which is why the movies are such a failure at the moment. Fortunately, Gillen seems to understand what he's doing when it comes to writing Star Wars comics, and this was a great continuation of Aphra's story after the Vader comic, so it's definitely worth reading. Pencils were done by Kev Walker with colours by Antonio Fabella, and they both did a good job. I'm not a fan of overly cartoony art like this book has, but fortunately Aphra's quirky tone and the speed of the comic, and the zany antics that pop up, work well with the cartoony style, so it's not something I would normally enjoy, but I did enjoy it here because it matched the tone of the story, and if Volume 2 has art just like this, I will be very happy. So the first half of the book was fantastic, but the problem is once that's over, there's the second half of the book which is just fucking dreadful. Everything that makes Aphra a likeable character and a likeable readable comic is swept under the rug in the Screaming Citadel, and Jason Aaron wades in with his Star Wars shit. Not being content with having wrecked the main comics, he clearly set his sights on Dr. Aphra. If you ask people what one of the worst Star Wars books is in Legends, there's always one that more than a few people will say. Is it Dawn of the Jedi? Is it Red Harvest? Is it Fatal Alliance? Nope. The one more people would say overall is the Crystal Star, and it's always for the same reason. Nobody likes the way Vonda N. McIntyre brought in mythological creatures into the Star Wars mythos. Things like vampires, mummies, and werewolves just don't fit in Star Wars, the same way giant space hyper-travel whales don't. Star Wars isn't a 50s B-movie, horror movie, and authors shouldn't treat it as such. So what did Jason Aaron introduce into the Star Wars mythos? Vampires. Why would anyone do that, especially after the way people complained about it in Legends? You know it won't go down well, but you still do it anyway, because of what? Arrogance? Naivety? Because you've never read a Star Wars book or comic in your life, but now you're in charge of writing one? Whatever the reason, he did it, and it absolutely ruins the second half of this book. I guess I wouldn't have minded so much if the comic had maintained its overall light tone, but it didn't, and the humour's all but gone, and the art style is one of those hyper-realistic with digital art things that people love so much these days, and personally I think is overused. But the point is, it doesn't fit the tone of the light-hearted and humorous adventures we want and expect from Aphra. It's really out of place. We didn't like Aphra as a character in Vader because she had a super moody, dark, gritty tone, so to force that in here is a total mistake. I have no idea why Gillen went along with Aaron's ideas, apart from to be polite and have a good working relationship with him, but Aaron's influence can be felt here, and it's in such a bad way. Needless to say, I was so incredibly disappointed with this arc. To be fair, it is a crossover with the main series, but that just makes it worse, with Salvador Larroca's obvious and unacceptable tracing in the main series now present in this book, and the tone is a complete mismatch with Aphra's artwork. Combine the story with the artwork and it's just absolute crap. And talking about the main comic, why the hell are issues 31 and 32 of that series in this book, but not in the Star Wars Volume 3 hardcover? If anything, Screaming Citadel belonged in that book as well, but if they wanted to include it here, they also should have printed it in Star Wars Volume 3. You can't call it Star Wars Volume 3 if you just leave out entire issues of a run and put them in a completely different hardcover. That's a complete fucking joke. Basically, the Screaming Citadel story revolves around Aphra telling Luke she knows he has Jedi potential, and she can help train him by using Rur's computer core to teach him. But the only caveat is, to unlock it, they have to travel to the Screaming Citadel, where once a year the Queen trades favours for meeting interesting people, and in this case, Aphra is hoping to unlock Rur's core, and in exchange, she'll let the Vampire Queen do whatever she wants with Luke. The downside is the extremely dangerous Abyssin symbiotes from earlier in the book are being used by the Queen to control everyone in the Citadel, and between her trying to eat Luke's soul and the symbiotes, all hell breaks loose. Eventually the good guys beat the bad guys, they escape, the Queen dies, but the symbiotes live on, so there's still a potential threat to the galaxy further down the road, and that's the end of that. I found it to be a very disappointing arc because, as I said, tonally, it's just not Star Wars, and the art is all over the place. The Screaming Citadel Part 1 is a one-shot that isn't part of the Star Wars or Aphra series, with art by Marco Gicchetto and Andre Mossa, and I'm getting so bored with these two. Sure, there isn't technically anything wrong with their style. In fact, technically, it's very good, but that doesn't make it enjoyable when every comic these two put out looks identical with a severe lack of variation in colour. It's always these two-tone comics. Shattered Empire, Captain Phasma, Obi-Wan and Anakin. Every comic looks the same, it always has the two-tone colouring thing, and it sucks all the fun out of reading a new comic. After the initial issue, there's 4 more issues alternating between Star Wars 31, Dr. Aphra 7, Star Wars 32 and Dr. Aphra 8. The Star Wars issues were drawn by Salvador Larroca and coloured by Edgar Delgado, and it's absolute shit. I would be ashamed if I was Salvador Larroca. It's so inconsistent and very disappointing. Half of Larroca's pencils are clearly traced, and I'll leave a pinned comment with links in it showing that, and Delgado's colours are all over the place, alternating between hyper-realistic shading and more traditional comic colouring. It's an absolute mess, and once again I ask, when did tracing in comics become acceptable? It's an absolute insult to the industry, to the people who carried it for decades, and to the fans and readers who buy the comics only to be given this tripe. It's an insult to everyone, and it needs to stop. Nobody on the planet who knows this is traced thinks LaRocca's work is impressive because it's traced. He's not impressing anyone. It just makes me roll my eyes and think this isn't worth the money. Yet again, I have no idea why I expected anything more from Disney Star Wars these days, or Marvel for that matter, but I do. The comic industry was built on original art and ideas, not tracing, and it has to stop. Marvel can't seem to understand why they can't keep sales up. I've got an idea, stop gender swapping every character and letting artists trace. They do that, and I guarantee their revenue will go up. Dr. Aphra issues 7 and 8 were done by penciler Andrea Broccardo and colorist Antonio Fabella, and I suspect the change in penciler is because there's usually 6 issues or so in a trade, and that's generally when they changed creative teams if they're going to. But it was a shame to see Walker go, because I have to say I really enjoyed his style, and Broccardo's just isn't as good. It's a more basic style that I'm not a fan of, and while it's not the end of the world and the issues were readable, I would have preferred if Walker had stayed on as penciler. So yeah, Screaming Citadel is an absolute shit show. It's got a shitty story, shitty artwork, tracing. I just don't know what anyone was thinking when this was put together, and in my mind it's an excellent example of why it's a good thing Jason Aaron isn't working on Star Wars anymore. I think it's time for some fresh blood in the Star Wars books and comics, and I'm pleased to see Aaron is gone. All the issues start with the covers, which I'm a fan of, and the back of the book has all the variant covers. When the dust jacket is removed, it has a wraparound image taken from the Mile High Comics variant of the Screaming Citadel by Mike Mayhew, which ironically is the only cover I noticed was missing from the back of the book. I don't know why they'd leave that one out, especially considering it was divided into 5, so each issue in the story had part of that art as a cover. The art on the boards is only actually 2 covers, there's another 3, which sadly aren't contained in this book, and that's not good. So the Aphra comic itself was very enjoyable, but the Screaming Citadel crossover with the main comic really missed the mark. Hopefully the second volume will just be Aphra and no crossover, because that's where she really shines, when she's just being her troublesome self. That is, of course, assuming there will ever be a volume 2. Sadly, if you look at the release dates for the hardcovers of the Star Wars comics, you'll see that they should have at least announced volume 2, but they haven't, and if you look at the Star Wars main comic, they should have at least announced volume 4, but they haven't. They've announced comics till the end of the year and into 2020. They've even announced an Age of the Republic hardcover, which I did say I wanted, slated to be released sometime in February 2020. But no more hardcovers for Aphra or the flagship comic, or for Darth Vader Dark Lord of the Sith Volume 2 for that matter. Does that mean they've given up? I've tried contacting them multiple times through Twitter, through Facebook, through email, through their own site, and Marvel won't even acknowledge that I've asked them. Not so much as a thanks for your interest, but we're not sure if we'll be doing them yet, but we'll announce it if we do. Marvel, yet another company that thinks its fans are below them, but that's hardly surprising since Marvel is owned by Disney. I personally won't be buying the Aphra or Star Wars trades. I will be waiting for the hardcovers. I like the oversized format because it shows off the art more, they last longer, they have more protection, and to be honest, I love the way they look on my shelves. When I buy canon Star Wars books and comics, I generally try to buy them either used in very good or like new condition, or with a remainder mark, so they only get the cost of production back and very little else. I'm certainly not going to buy the trades new, then buy the hardcovers. Disney Star Wars just isn't that good, and I don't like giving them my money, to be honest, hence me trying to buy them not new. I don't want to fund Disney Star Wars. So yes, I'm looking forward to reading the next part of Aphra's story, but no, I won't be reading it if it's not released in hardcover. Marvel and Disney need to sort their shit out, because as someone who's collected hardcovers in these series, it's a bit insulting that they've taken my money up to this point and just decided, well, we're not going to do it anymore. As for this volume, the first half was good, but the second half was abysmal and completely missed the tone Star Wars has. It's like Jason Aaron tried to be far too serious for what should have been a fun adventure, but that doesn't surprise me. After reading the first 2.5 volumes of his run on Star Wars, I can safely say they got progressively shittier, so I'm not in the slightest bit surprised he got it wrong here too. Hopefully the next volume of Aphra will just be Gillen, because he just understands the character and writes her better than anyone else, which makes sense because after all he created the character, he wrote her in the Vader omnibus. It makes sense that he can produce stories for her better than anyone else. So overall, I have mixed feelings about this. If you like Aphra and don't care about the hardcovers, I'd recommend reading her trades but skipping Screaming Citadel. Otherwise you'll end up like me, just waiting and waiting for a hardcover release that, given the plunging sales and interest in Star Wars as a whole, may never see the light of day. Aphra herself is a very, very fun character, when Gillen writes her anyway, so I'd recommend reading any of his solo stuff about her any way you can, and for the love of God, don't read any of Jason Aaron's stuff, it's fucking awful. It's such a shame. Dr. Aphra had so much potential because she doesn't play by the rules, and this could have been an amazing volume, but it was let down by Aaron's poor writing and LaRocca's very clearly traced art, and ultimately that makes this book disappointing.